We are now in public session. Getting to the end of the term. We are now in public session. Just not meant to happen today. Just give us a few minutes to relax there. Okay, we are now in public session. At the request of the broadcasting recording server, members and visitors in the public gallery are requested to ensure that for the duration of their meeting, their mobile phones are turned off completely or switched to airplane, safe or flight mode, depending on their device. It is not sufficient just to put your phones on silent mode, as this will maintain a level of interference with the broadcasting system. Housing with people with disabilities resumed, and I would like to welcome to today's meeting Dublin City Council Ms Rose Kenny from the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government, Ms Caroline Timmins, Mr Aidan O'Reilly, Mr John Wickham and Mr Alan Byrne, and from the Department of Health Mr Kathleen McLennan and Ms Patsy Carr. Just note on privilege before we begin, I wish to draw your attention to the fact by virtue of Section 1721 of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses that are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise nor make charges against any person, identity by name or in such way as to make him, her or it identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the House or an official either by name or in such way as to make him or her identifiable. I now call on Ms Rose Kenny to make the opening statement.
Good morning, Chair. I've circulated a statement from Dublin City Council's perspective on delivering on this. The National Housing Strategy for People with a Disability 2011-2016 and the associated National Implementation Framework are joint publications by the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government and the Department of Health. Building on the programme for government commitment to meet the housing needs of people with disabilities, the strategy has been affirmed in Rebuilding Ireland, Action Plan on Housing and Homelessness, and extended to 2020 to continue to deliver on its aims. The vision of the strategy is to facilitate access for people with disabilities to the appropriate range of housing and related support services, delivered in an integrated and sustainable manner which promotes equality of opportunity, including choice and independent living. Dublin City Council's strategic plan for housing people with disability was launched in January 2016. A multi-agency steering group consisting of a wide range of statutory and disability advocacy organisations, including Dublin City Council departments, the HSE, the Irish Wheelchair Association, was established, and the group meets 4 times a year to oversee the implementation of the strategic plan. The Council's housing supply programme outlines the current and proposed projects under each of the various funding streams. All new units comply with current building regulations and are fully wheelchair accessible. A template for disabled adapted units is currently being designed by the Housing Department City Architects Division in collaboration with the steering group, and work on this template commenced in January of this year and is ongoing. When completed, the submission will be made available to the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government for oversight and approval or consideration. It's proposed to incorporate this template into new City Council developments when the necessary approvals are obtained. It is City Council's policy to allocate a minimum of 5% of all homes allocated per year to people with a disability. Statistics for 2017 and 18 and Q1 of 2019 are set out below. Applicants provide medical documentation on their application for social housing support, and approximately 7.5% of applicants on DCC's waiting list are applicants with a disability. So I've set out the numbers there, so I'll take them as read. So then in addition, the City Council operates 10 accessibility and disability programme for its own stock. So the Accessibility and Disability Programme is available to Dublin City Council tenants who are experiencing a condition which makes living in their home and performing daily tasks difficult. The programme provides adaptations such as stair lifts, ramps, level access showers and extensions. Providing these adaptations improves tenants' quality of life and in some cases allows people to remain in their homes and continue independent living. This can help reduce the requirement for transferring tenants to other properties, a process that can be disruptive for the tenant, and it's more economically onerous than on the City Council. And again, I've set out the adaptations for 2016, 2018 for the committee. For 2000 and right down to 2019. So the Accessibility and Disability Programme is managed by Housing Maintenance within the City Council, and all applications require a doctor's certificate, and some applicants, such as those for stair lifts and extensions, require an occupational therapist report. All valid applications are surveyed before a decision is made on the application to ensure the works are feasible. If granted, the works are carried out then by Dublin City Council's own maintenance department, supervised by the Housing Maintenance Department. The budget for that programme is €2.5 million. This is considerable demand on the programme, and funds can be recouped from the Department of Housing, Community and Local Government. The limit on recoupment is 90% of the cost, or in the case of extensions, $75,000, subject to the conditions of the department's scheme. City Council operates then grants for adaptations of privately owned dwellings. Dublin City Council administers 3 housing grant schemes which are designed to provide assistance to people making adaptations to their privately owned homes to meet their medical needs, and to older people in poor housing conditions carrying out essential repairs to their owner-occupied homes. These schemes are designed to provide financial and technical assistance towards the adaptation improvements to homes to make them more sustainable for independent living. So the housing adaptation for people with a disability. The scheme is designed to assist in carrying out of work which are necessary for the purpose of rendering a house more suitable for the accommodation of a person with a disability. The type of works allowable under the scheme include the provision of bathroom extensions, bedroom extensions, ensuite bathrooms, bathroom conversions, garage conversions, understair toilets, facilities, stair lifts, through-floor lifts, electronic environmental controls, adaptations to facilitate wheelchair access to a home, any other works which are reasonably necessary for the purposes of rendering a house more suitable for the accommodation of a person with a disability. And the maximum grant available under the scheme is $30,000, and I set out there the scheme, the qualifications for the scheme. The second scheme is the Mobility Aids Housing Grant Scheme, and this covers a basic suite of works to address mobility problems. The grant typically covers such works as level access showers, ramps, grab rails, etc. The maximum grant available under this scheme is $6,000, or 100% of the approved cost, whichever is the lesser. The grant is available to households whose gross household income does not exceed €30,000 per annum. And finally, the Housing Aid for Older Persons Grant Scheme. This scheme is open to people over 66 years of age and is designed to assist older people living in poor housing conditions to have necessary repairs or improvements carried out. The types of works typically would include rewiring or the provision of central heating and the replacement of boilers, etc. And the maximum grant available under this scheme is $8,000. And I've set out the details of it there. All applications under the Housing Applications Grant Scheme for people with a disability and the Housing Aid for the older people are assessed based on gross household income and shall be between 30% and 95% of the approved cost of the works. Household income is calculated on the annual gross income of all household members over 18 years or over 23 from full-time education the previous tax year, done in accordance with the Department of Housing Planning and Local Government guidelines. The allocation for 2019 is 8.4 million, which 1.7 will be provided from Dublin City Council's own resources. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Rose. Caroline.
Good morning, Lasker Hirlich, members of the committee and staff of the Secretariat. I would like to thank the Joint Committee for inviting the Department to discuss the subject of housing for people with disabilities. I'm joined today by my colleagues Aidan O'Reilly, Principal, John Wickham, Senior Building Standards Advisor, and Alan Byrne, Assistant Principal. At the outset, I would like to assure the committee that the provision of housing for people with disabilities is a key priority for the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government and for housing authorities. Working with a range of stakeholders, we are committed to achieving positive change for people with disabilities through the National Housing Strategy for People with a Disability. Recognising that people with disability often have fewer choices in providing for their housing and accommodation needs, and the importance of delivering better outcomes for these specific needs households, the aim of this strategy, which was jointly published with the Department of Health, is to facilitate access for people with disabilities to the appropriate range of housing and related support services. A key objective is also to ensure that services are delivered in an integrated and sustainable manner, which promotes equality of opportunity, individual choice and independent living. The strategy was developed as a part of a coherent framework in conjunction with a vision for change, the strategy document which sets out the direction for mental health services, the proposals of the report on the working group on congregated settings, and the ongoing review of disability services to support people with disabilities in community-based living with maximum independence and choice. The strategy has 9 strategic aims which collectively promote access for people with a disability to the full range of housing options available. One of the most important aims of the strategy is to foster effective interagency cooperation. Subsequent to the original publication of the strategy, a national implementation framework was developed and a partnership approach to implementation has been adopted between the 2 departments, the Housing Agency, local authorities and disability stakeholders, and we are working as a team to achieve the aims of the strategy. This partnership approach has contributed in no small measure to a full appreciation of the fact that the provision of suitable housing is only one element in supporting people with disabilities to live fully inclusive lives. Whether a person with a disability is moving from an institutional setting or is already in the community, the personal care and other supports necessary to enable this must also be a part of the offer of housing where these are necessary. Identified actions in the strategy are driven primarily by the Housing Agency and a dedicated housing subgroup, comprising representatives from my department, the Health Service Executive, the Department of Health, local authorities, the Irish Council for Social Housing and various disability representative organisations. At departmental level, an implementation monitoring group, which includes representatives from disability organisations, is chaired at Assistant Secretary level, was established in 2012, and this group monitors and reports on progress under the strategy. From a strategic perspective, one of the most significant achievements of the strategy is the establishment of the Housing and Disability Steering Groups in each local authority area, who have prepared their own localised strategic plans for delivering housing in their areas for people with disabilities. The HDSGs are chaired by the Local Authorities Director of Housing Services, with representatives from the HSE, the approved housing body sector and representatives of the 4 disability sectors completing the membership. It should be noted that these have been established in each of the 31 local authorities. People with disabilities are entitled to apply to their local authority for the full range of housing supports that are available to all applicants for housing support, including the housing assistance payment. The annual summary of social housing assessments provides data at local authority level as to how many households with disabilities are on the social housing waiting list at a given point in time each year. In 2018, there were 4,037 households with a disability on the list, down from 4,326 in 2017. Local authorities know from this data how many households they need to plan for, and the national guidelines for the assessment and allocation process for housing provision for people with a disability ensure that they are enabled to appropriately assess applications for housing by persons with a disability. These guidelines were revised in 2017 and are a very practical and useful tool for local authorities in their assessment of applications at local level. The delivery of housing for people with disabilities by local authority and approved housing bodies is funded in a number of ways. Housing may be provided directly through the local authority capital programme, the long-term leasing programmes, or by way of the capital assistance scheme and the capital advanced leasing facility, programmes delivered through the approved housing body sector. In particular, the capital assistance scheme is directly targeted at providing accommodation for specific categories of need, including disability. 80.65 million was provided for dwellings under the CAS scheme in 2018, with a budget allocation of 94.87 million in 2019. There is also a further specific funding available to local authorities of 15.075 million for the Disabled Persons Grant Scheme and the Improving Works in lieu of Local Authority Housing Scheme. That's an increase of over 1 million from 2018 levels. In addition to CAS funding for new accommodation, the Housing Adaptation Grants for Older People and People with a Disability Scheme provides funding for adaptations and extensions to private housing for people with disabilities to ensure that they can continue to live in their own homes. In 2018, 9,413 grants were provided under the scheme, with a total investment of 64.41 million. Funding for the scheme has increased year on year since 2014 and has been increased again in 2019 to 71.25 million, an increase of some 8% on the 2018 allocation. Significant work is being progressed to streamline how this scheme operates at local authority level, and it will continue throughout the year with the introduction of a streamlined application process expected by year end. A key aim of the work is to ensure that the increased funding spreads the benefits as widely as possible to those who need it most, and that the grants support the maximum number of households. While funding for physical adaptations for people with disabilities is important, we should remember that there are many people with disabilities who do not require physical adaptations, but for whom the design and location of housing is important. The housing strategy for people with a disability calls for the integration of good practice in the design and coordination of housing and related support for people with disabilities, and in this regard a number of initiatives have been put in place. The HSE and the Housing Agency have jointly published guidelines entitled Design for Mental Health, which is an international first of its kind. The guidelines identify ways in which homes can be designed to help to overcome the barriers to independent living experienced by people with certain mental health conditions. In addition, the Housing Agency is launching a new website with the title housingforall.ie, which is a design roadmap for anyone seeking an overview on providing accommodation for people with a disability, and it provides links to existing published legislation and guidance. Part M of the building regulations underpins the principle of universal design and aims to foster an inclusive approach to the design and construction of the built environment. For dwellings, Part M aims to ensure that all new dwellings are visitable. The Department works closely with the National Disability Authority and other stakeholders in reviewing and developing building regulations. In this context, future-proofing of all new housing versus adaptation of homes for individual specific needs as they arise requires a strong evidence-based approach. The Department understands that the NDA are working on a cost-benefit analysis of universal design in the context of Action 97 of the National Disability Inclusion Strategy 2017 to 2021. Government policies of improved land use, compact development and sustainable communities are manifesting in an increase in apartment buildings in urban centres. These embrace the fundamental principles of universal design and designing for all by their very nature and the requirements of the design guidelines for apartments. The Department has also collaborated with the Centre for Excellence in Universal Design on Homes for Smart Ageing Universal Design Challenge, an initiative under the Rebuilding Ireland Programme's Action 2.19 and the Programme of Actions for Smart Ageing. The National Housing Strategy for People with a Disability is in its 8th year, and we are now beginning to look to 2020 when it will be reviewed. The committee can be assured that we are committed to building on the progress made to date and to ensuring that people with a disability have the housing supports and services they require. I thank the committee again for the invitation to today's session, and my colleagues and myself are more than happy to deal with any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thanks, Caroline. I now call on Kathleen to make her opening statement.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning. I would like to thank the committee for the invitation to be here today. I'm accompanied by Patsy Carr, Principal Officer of the Disability Unit in the Department of Health. A major reform programme is underway in health funded disability services called Transforming Lives. This programme is driving the implementation of the recommendations of the Department of Health's 2012 Value for Money and Policy Review of Disability Services. Transforming Lives supports national policies that will deliver person-centred models of care services to ensure that people with disabilities are supported to make the types of choice about their lives which are available to everyone else in society. And this we call the social care model, and it is a significant shift in our approach to how we support people with disabilities through the health and social care services. In a housing context, this includes the implementation of the 2011 Time to Move On from Congregated Settings, a strategy for community inclusion, and I understand the committee has a particular interest in relation to the decongregation programme. First of all, I would like to clarify who health and our social care service users are. About 1 in 7 people in our society has a disability. Over 90% of these are supported through ordinary community health and social services rather than specialist ones. And this mainstream first approach is underpinned in the Disability Act 2005, which requires public bodies like the HSE to include people with disabilities in their mainstream services. The fundamental principle underpinning this disability policy is to support people with disabilities to maximise their full potential and to live ordinary lives as independently as possible in the community. For those with more complex needs, general community and health and social care services are complemented by specialist community-based disability services, who deliver specialist services to the remaining around 9% of those with a disability, and this is about 56,000 people. And this is through a range of services that includes early intervention, multidisciplinary therapies, including habilitation, rehabilitation and behaviour support. Staffed supported housing, including specialist end-of-life care, respite and short breaks to support carers, day services and support for community engagement, personal assistance and home help, assistive technology and peer support organisations. The Health Service Executive Budget allocation for disability services is £1.9 billion in 2019, and 65% of this is allocated to funding supports for those living in group homes or other residential arrangements. Up to 80% of these disability services are delivered on behalf of the HSE by the voluntary sector, while the remaining 20% is provided directly by the HSE. In addition, a small amount of services is delivered by private providers. The vast majority of the 56,000 people with disabilities, including those with significant disabilities and accessing specialist services, live at home with parents or other family. In terms of full-time care, around 8,500 people who principally have intellectual disabilities live in supported housing. 3/4 of supportive housing for people with disabilities is now ordinary housing based in the community. A typical group home would have 4 residents with disabilities assisted by support staff. A congregated setting, however, is defined as where 10 or more people with disabilities are living together in a single unit or are campus-based. 10 years ago, in 2009, the number of persons living in a congregated setting numbered 4,000. By 2012, that figure was 3,400. And the Programme for Government 2016 set a target to reduce the number in congregated settings by 1/3 by 2021, and this target will be met. In line with government policy, large residential institutions and campus-based housing are being phased out as initiatives that underpin and enable a new model for residential support in the mainstream community, where people with disabilities are supported to live ordinary lives in ordinary places, becomes the norm. And I would like to clarify that the decongregation policy focused on HSE-funded services, and it does not include persons with a disability under 65 who live in a nursing home. Inclusive communities and community activities, disability-friendly environments and buildings, and universal design are all part of the wider canvas enabling people with disabilities to live normal lives. The process of moving individuals from large congregated settings, where many have lived for all of their lives, involves fundamental change for the individual at the centre of the move. The transition to community housing requires person-centred planning, supporting and encouraging individuals to make their own choices about where they want to live and who they wish to share their home with. And this is consistent with Article 19A of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which was ratified last year by the Irish Government. In addition, other necessary work required to facilitate transitioning continues, and this includes sourcing properties in the community, carrying out any modifications required to meet individual needs or requirements required by HICWA for registration and compliance. And it is noteworthy that significant progress has been made in this area. In its first 5-year progress report, 2012 to 2017, HSE reported 661 people moved to the community, 592 people passed away, and 222 people were admitted or readmitted. The data shows that people of all ages have successfully transited to community housing. Of those who moved, the average age is 52, and the average length of time spent living in a congregated setting was 28 years. But it is notable that, in fact, a number of people have been living in congregated settings for over 50 years. Notably, positive outcomes are reported for those who transitioned, regardless of the level of disability support needs. So, for example, 32% had moderate learning disability and 39% had a severe learning disability. Between 2016 and mid-2019, the transition of 272 people across 10 priority sites was completed. The model of housing provision for these who transitioned varied, and that ranged from HSE Disability Capital Programme to CAS arrangements or private rental. Funding from the Service Reform Fund, which is a joint initiative of the Department of Health, Atlantic Philanthropies and the HSE, towards the cost of moving to a person-centred model of service and supports, has played a very important role in ensuring the success of each move. The key enablers to successful transitions that have been identified so far, and we are on a learning journey here, are the importance of engagement and communication and focused leadership. The challenges have included the need to manage the communication process, gaining access to suitable properties, and the availability of revenue to fund community-based supports. While this process can take time, the real priority is to do it right, to do it well, and maintain focus on the outcomes to be achieved for each individual. And the committee will be interested to note that a number of congregated settings have closed, and the number of people living in houses with more than 3 others has significantly reduced. The National Disability Authority is conducting an in-depth evaluation of the decongregation programme, and this will include before and after interviews with those who transition in the community, and this will be very welcome to support our learning on what are the key enablers or what enhances the moves to the community. So it is of note that between 2012 and 2017, the NDA have been interviewing a number of probably around 150 before and after their moves, which has given us a lot of learning in terms of moving forward our programme. This evaluation programme is called Moving In, and also 2 years post-transition interviews show that many of those were aged 78 years and several others of those are in their 70s. So we are talking about an aged community moving from congregated settings where they have lived for a long time in their lives out into the community. So moving to the future, under the Sláinte Care Action Plan, work is ongoing to establish future social care needs for people with a disability. So building on the 2018 report on future needs for disability services, we are extending our forecasts of needs out to 2032 in order to support Department of Health planning for social needs into the future. Our disability demographics indicate that the number of people with intellectual disabilities who will require a supported housing place in future years will grow as a result of changes in the size and the age structure of the disability population. Of particular concern is the number of older people with disabilities being supported by very elderly parents or siblings. This is not a sustainable situation, given both the individual's increasing dependence as they age and the failing health and strength of those they depend on. So tailored population projections of the number of people with intellectual disabilities will forecast those who require housing support in the future. In addition, provision is required to meet the supported housing needs of people with physical and sensory disabilities or those with an acquired brain injury, who account for an additional 10% of the overall requirement of specialist disability supportive housing. Our goal within the Department of Health is to provide care and support to all service users at the lowest level of complexity, as close to home as possible, supporting people to live independently in their own community for as long as possible. In terms of people living with a disability, this requires cross-departmental engagement on activities such as housing, environment, transport, social protection and education. And this important principle, that the needs of people with a disability extend well beyond health service provision, is recognised by the National Disability Inclusion Strategy. The Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government commits specific funding for the delivery of homes to support people transitioning to the community, as you will have just heard. Since 2014, a number of innovative projects have been funded through the housing sector to test and demonstrate the feasibility of different approaches in relation to the funding, design and configuration of housing for people with disabilities. The Department of Health looks forward to continuing to work closely with the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government to further develop innovative and responsive housing solutions to meet the needs of those with a disability in line with our strategy for community inclusion. I would like to thank the committee again for the invitation to come here today, and we are available to answer any questions that the committee may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen. Victor.
Thank you, Cathaoirleach. Firstly, I'd like to thank Rose, Caroline and Kathleen for their presentation of their papers today. And I suppose this is a continuation of some discussion we had last week. And just when we go back, I'll make a few points and I'll ask you questions. But when we look at the National Housing Strategy for people with disabilities, some of the core, there are 9 key areas of actions that you all know about, and I'm not going to repeat here. But you know, when we look at we promote the mainstream equality and access to a full range of housing options, develop national protocols and frameworks for effective integration and cooperation for housing, and support people with disabilities. And my experience is one of being a councillor for many years in Dunleary at Down County Council, but not specific to Dunleary at Down Council itself, but other councils, and my engagement with local authorities is that constantly, I know people with disabilities that are 10 and 12 and 13 years waiting for accommodation. That's a travesty. And when we talk about independent living, we have to talk about sustainable living, independent living with dignity, and that people can engage in their meaningful lives and also live with who they wish. And I think that was an interesting point that you made, Kathleen. And I suppose really I just want to touch on a few issues. And firstly, my experience is one of that people are waiting years. And they are told, sometimes the question, say, why aren't they back living with their parents? I mean, a 30-year-old woman was telling me the other day that she was asked, why wasn't she back with her parents? And look, they couldn't find suitable accommodation. And the accommodation that was coming back from housing stock wasn't suitable for whatever reason, and I understand that. And yet somehow it's always after the event. And I'm conscious of, in another part of Dublin where Clúid is going to be building 90 houses, and I rang them up the other day and said, did you consider putting 10% of those with suitable for people with disabilities? And they said they hadn't yet thought about it. But I think we've got to get in earlier in the planning process. And so the 3 questions I'd like to ask Rose. One, you might share with us if you can today, because I'm not saying you have this at the top of your head, but what is the current number of people, persons in Dublin City Council housing list, or the transfer list, that you have housed coming from congregated settings in the last 12 months? You might just share that information with us, with the committee at a future time. And has DCC rolled out a one-stop shop for providing services for disability persons? As per the strategy plan, there was a commitment that there be one-stop shop set in each local authority. I'd be interested in hearing that. In relation then to planning, I'm hearing reports of people who are seeking planning permission either to build a property in the grounds of their parents' house or their family member, or a standalone site. And there doesn't seem to be a heavy weight by planning authorities in recognising the exceptional health circumstances of the applicant. So this isn't just something that they've made it up. This is something that's backed up with doctors, consultants' reports, etc. And there was to be a waiting to support people who wished to build a house, specially adapted property on a site. And that's a planning code issue, but you might address it or have a look at that. In relation to the housing steering committees, Caroline, you talk about every one of the 31 local authorities having these steering committees. Are they constantly reviewed? For instance, if this committee was to seek a report on each of the steering committees, their targets, their achievements in the last 12 months, could that be delivered to us? Could we receive a report on each of the 31 local authorities, or are you aware of it? Who's monitoring all of this? What's the outputs in relation to this? So we have all these committees, because the one thing that strikes me about this particular issue, we have reams and reams of paper, reams and reams of objectives, but I don't know who's monitoring it all, and I want to see results. So perhaps you might come back to me on that. Who are these key people in these 31 local authorities by name? Can we have a contact for them? When was their last report? When was their last appraisal of their deliveries in relation to this strategy? Because I would like this committee to see them, and maybe you might be able to tell us something in relation to that. And then just to go back again in relation to Kathleen and these congregated settings. You've missed the targets. The targets were that in 2000, substantial people would be transferred in 2019 out of congregated settings. And yes, I acknowledge there are difficulties in terms of sourcing a suitable accommodation, because it isn't good enough to take people out of congregated settings and, excuse the pun, dump them in other accommodation. And that's what I've heard from some people. Some people have been forced out of congregated settings and have not got, also been put out many, many miles away out of the community that they've grown up in. And also no supports. And I keep hearing, oh, they don't have sufficient money or resources in terms of the transitional supports for these people. So I really want to hear, what is the plan and how is it all dovetailing with the local authorities? Because I'm not convinced. And I'm particularly aware of one particular organisation that has had about, 20 people have had to leave there in the last few years, and they haven't had good experiences. And what's more important, they haven't had a forum or anyone to listen to their bad experiences and to say what could have been done and are we learning something from it. So just can you share with us what the relationship between your organisation, the agencies, the multi-approach agency approach with the local authorities, in terms of getting a priority for housing that is appropriate for their needs, that is close to their loved ones and support where they want to live, because the key word in all this has to be about choice for the people that are living there. So they're just some key points you might address.
Thank you, Senator. I'll take two at a time this morning. Owen, do you want?
Yeah, sure. I have 4 just specific questions for the department. Thanks, folks, for the presentations. And I've no problem deferring to the Senator.
No, work away. Apologies.
So I've 4 specific questions for the department, and then depending on those answers, I'll come back in. So they're very specific. Caroline, does the department know what percentage of the social housing construction pipeline currently in train is designed specifically for people with disabilities? Does the department know what percentage of allocations of social housing in 2018 went to people with disabilities of the 4 categories that are recorded? Does the department know what percentage of applicants on the current social housing waiting list have a member of the household who's a wheelchair user and therefore needs a wheelchair accessible house? And do we know the average waiting times, either statewide or by local authority, for the length of time it takes for an adaptation grant to be processed? And once somebody's approved, for the length of time before the grant is provided and the adaptations are done? they're my questions, and I'll come back in after the answers. Thanks, Chair.
Grant, where will I start? We'll start with Rose, will I?
The issue of the planning permission, I'm Dublin City, so extensions and developments in existing gardens was your question. Is there exceptional
standalone sites.
Okay.
But there should be a heavy weight given to people that can demonstrate they have particular or special health needs, proven needs, to stay and reside in a particular section of the community.
Okay, and I'll have to come back to you on that.
Yeah, fair enough.
That's good. I can certainly check that out for you. Then regarding the question on the number of people on the waiting list you asked specifically that are in congregated settings, what I can say to you is that we have, with a primary disability code priority, we have 1,322. Disability, 1,322, but I can't break that into congregated settings, but I can do that. Now, the question of a one-stop shop, I will revert to. I know our implementation group is led by the Housing Delivery Senior Executive Officer, and that group meet and certainly are working, but I'll revert on the issue of a one-stop shop specifically. But obviously, I suppose just to be clear, and if you look at the numbers on the report, we would, all of the people on the waiting list under the various categories, the disability category is you know, it's exactly the same as any other, in the sense that once the person is eligible and reaches that point on the list, the housing department will ensure that an appropriate allocation is made or transfer as required.
Caroline?
Senator Boyhan's question in relation to the housing disability steering groups. They're actually an important innovation because I think, and you've heard last week at the committee, it's very important that the awareness at local authority levels is increased, because if it's before you take more notice, and obviously the allocations process doesn't happen at department level, that happens at the local authority level. So the department is very conscious that that needs to be happening, and the point of having the 4 disability sectors represented on those committees, that's exceptionally important. So even just setting them up in the first stage was a very good step, but I think what Senator Boyhan is getting at, are they actually working effectively? And the Housing Agency has been given the specific task to work with them, and has been doing a lot of work with them over the past year in particular, to look at their terms of reference to ensure that they're functioning properly. They're meant to meet 4 times a year and be chaired by their Director of Housing. And I think what the Housing Agency is currently doing is making sure that they're working to work out what's the percentage of housing they need to provide, making sure that they are conscious of who they need to allocate to, making plans for that allocation. They've all done their strategic plans now, so I am aware of that, and they're all available. So if you did want those, we could get those for you. Yeah, we can ask for the strategic plans. And I think what they're doing now is looking at their terms of reference and asking them to be more ambitious in their targets. So now that we've got the supply issue coming through, we've got more supply of social housing coming. That was one of the keys that we needed to enable, because there's no point in looking at allocating if you haven't got the houses to allocate. Now that we do, and that's starting to come through, it's to make sure that those strategic plans plan for some of that housing to be specifically for those people who are waiting for those housing on those housing lists. Now, I would concur with you. It is appalling for people to have to wait for a very long time. I think that's a factor of how complex it is, perhaps, to deal with disability, and the only way that we can do that is to have that thought about at the very early level of allocation. And that's about making those steering groups work in that sense. So I think you're certainly right in that respect, that we need to make those to function properly. But again, the Housing Agency is very aware of it and working very hard on that, I would say. In respect of Deputy O'Brien's questions, I think you asked, do I know what percentage of social housing in the pipeline is being designed for people with disability? I'm sorry, Deputy O'Brien, I don't have that data with me. I will see if I can get it for you. There is an issue, I suppose, in that the amount of data that we're collecting on housing, we need to be clear that we're getting the types of data that we actually need. So I'd agree with you that type of data might be useful. So I will check when we go back to the department whether it is available. If it's not, I'll bring it up, that it's something that would be useful to gather. I think you asked what was the percentage of allocations in 2018. I think you've been provided with data by the Housing Agency in relation to the allocations for 2016, 2017 and 2018 in respect to the allocations in each of the local authorities. So that's what we asked the housing subgroup to collect each year so far. So No, in fact, in the Housing Agency's report, we give you the actual allocation figures.
Perfect.
So that's something we've been doing for the last 3 years. So you'll see that each local authority, you have a breakdown both in the 4 disability categories, so the physical, sensory, mental health and intellectual. You have the totals for 2016, 2017 and 2018, because it was an area we thought we needed more data on.
Do you have the report there?
Pardon?
You wouldn't just read into the record, I don't have it here, you wouldn't read into record just the last year, just...
Oh, sure, I can indeed. I can give you the overall total for 2018 was 1,457.
1,000.
457.
And what's that as a percentage of overall allocations?
I don't
for
know
that year?
what that is as a percentage of overall allocations. We'd have to get you that, but in fact, we don't.
Is that in the
collate
report?
Allocations. No, I don't think that's in the report.
That was what I was looking for. Is
yeah. Okay. Fair enough. But we have given you the figures in relation to what's been allocated, and those are broken down by local authority and by disability. So you can see that some improvement has been happening in that respect, and we'll keep working on making sure that those numbers are improved and making sure the targets are actually accelerated in that respect, because as social housing goes up, that allocation is expected to go up as well. I think you then asked me, do we know what percentage of applicants of households on the social housing waiting lists have wheelchairs? Now, in the summary of social housing assessment of 2018, you have the data as to how many are on the list. It's actually down in 2018 from 2017, as I said. You're correct that we don't collect which ones are wheelchair. I think it was brought up at the committee last week, and part of the issue is that there's not actually a box on the form. And I think you were thinking about whether that should be a recommendation. Yeah. If that is a recommendation that was made, I think we could accept it, because we have it has actually already come up for us, and we've decided that that should be done. So it's actually something that it might be a win, if you might say so. So I think you're right that that's information we do need to collect as well. But we'd be happy to take that on board. In relation to the adaptation grant, I might let my colleague Aidan here, who is in this field, reply to that particular question.
Okay. The feedback we'd had from local authorities regarding the housing adaptation grants would be the decision in a range of about 4 weeks to it can be up to 12 weeks, depending on the level of documentation that may need to be provided in that. We've just actually completed a process of meeting with all the 31 local authorities. I think the last session we had was last week. And out of that, it was, I suppose, very good to get the frontline local authority staff together, which was probably the first time that had been done in a comprehensive way, and get the feedback. We'd have certainly had an awareness ourselves that it was verified by the process about different processes, different levels of requirements on documentation and that, and we think there's good opportunities to streamline that, reduce the level of documentation. Some local authorities might be looking for a more stringent level of documentation than others, so they can present delays, and if we can streamline that, which I think we feel we can, and bring about a sharper turnaround time for decisions.
Okay, Kathleen.
I think just to concur, our significant priority across the Department of Health and the HSE is that those with a disability have a good transition, that transition is planned for, and that the opportunities are there for the individual to become a meaningful part of their own community. Just in relation to the figures, just to say, when we started in 2009, we had 4,000 people in a congregated setting. The latest figures that we have, which are the end of March, is that we now have 2,087. So we're looking at almost a 50% reduction in the numbers that are within congregated settings. And we would very clearly say that in the early years, we probably underestimated the length of preparation that it would take to support somebody to transition properly. And we're learning very much from the Service Reform Fund review and also from the NDA review, the real importance of early communication, that it can take up to a year or even longer to support somebody to make a decision that they want to move, how they want to move, where they want to move, and the kind of supports that are going to be needed. And I think, in fairness, we all underestimated that in the early years. So we have utilised that learning to try and accelerate and enhance the movement of those from congregated settings. So I've said we're almost at a 50% reduction at this stage since we started 10 years ago. But that doesn't mean that we need to, I suppose what that means is that we need to focus clearly on how we can accelerate and move forward. And we have committed to moving 160 people from congregated settings in 2019. I think the second point that I just want to make is that in relation to the CAS funding that is accessed for those with a disability is through the housing agencies for the local service providers as opposed to the general CAS funding. So it is a separate process that has been used. We've been working very closely, and I think we've been building our relationships very strongly with the Department of Housing. And in relation to the question around how we engage or how we work together. As has been outlined earlier by my colleague, we are part of a dedicated housing subgroup which is under the governance of the Department of Housing, which has representatives from Housing, the Health Service Executive, the Department, local authorities, the Irish Council for Social Housing and various disability representative organisations. And that is providing a very strong and key fora for that cross-agency working for identifying issues and difficulties and how we might work through them in the long term. But I think, you know, as I identified in the opening speech, many of those who are transitioning from congregated settings are of an older age. Many are in their 70s. Many have lived for a long time in congregated settings, and it's really important that we get that right. And I think we are very keen that all of the learning that we get from the National Disability Authority and those interviews of pre and post are put right back into the system for the learning, and I can assure you that they are. And the key pieces around communication and planning are at the very centre of what the HSE is utilising to deliver its decongregation programme at the minute.
Thank you, Owen. You've still some of your 5 minutes left. So.
Just very briefly, and Caroline, look, thank you very much for the answers. And I suppose the reason why I asked those specific questions was because if we are to ensure that people with disabilities are getting, I suppose, their fair share of allocations, some of those questions are the key kind of ways of monitoring that. So, for example, nobody knows the percentage of, the overall percentage of properties in social housing construction pipeline that are currently being designed for people with disabilities. Each individual local authority has that information, although they don't necessarily publish it. But I do think that would be a key metric, that in that report, if we were able to have that, because then we'd be able to say, okay, well, there's approximately 7% across the 4 categories of households that have somebody with a disability on the social housing waiting list. So we could track it year on year, whether that's 7%. I mean, Dublin City Council gave us really good data there that shows, in fact, they're exceeding that quite significantly. Other local authorities might have data to show otherwise. But I do think if we knew that centrally, that would be really useful. Likewise, the percentage of allocations, I think that's absolutely key. And again, I'm not asking for data for the sake of it. I think these are really key ways of tracking it. So if we don't know, or if nobody publishes what percentage of allocations last year went to people with one of the 4 categories of disability, again, that means we don't know if they're getting their fair share. So I think, you know, for the housing needs assessment reports and future housing agency disability reports, that would be useful. You're absolutely right, and I'm very positive for welcoming of your positive response to the wheelchair users, because I FOI'd every local authority on this recently, and about half of them don't even record it. They don't even know. So it's not even that the data is there and collected. So I think that would be a very positive thing. And the waiting times, 4 to 6 weeks is very positive. I have to say I come across a lot of cases where applicants could be waiting 6 months before a decision is made, and they could be waiting 2 to 3 years before the funding becomes available. Now, part of that is obviously the availability of finance, but that would suggest that there's a wide disparity of practice, and I welcome the fact that you're looking at it. I mean, for me, the key thing is, and when we asked the groups here last week, the key asks of the committee, 2 things jumped out at me. One is the 7%. That we have to recognise that if there's 7% of need in the overall social housing, then we have to deliver that and we have to track it, and I just want to emphasise that. But the second point is this: Part M, you know, people with disabilities live in these houses, they don't just visit them. And again, I think this was made very forcefully to us last week. So both in new house construction, private house construction and social house construction, we need Part M to operate in such a way as people don't just get to visit, people get to live in those houses. So, you know, I think, again, from the discussion last week, there is a real urgency to move beyond Part M having a visiting applicability. And I'm just wondering, is there a kind of a timeline for when those new guidelines will be in place? Because houses are being built, not fast enough for many of us, but they're being built at a level, they haven't been built for some time. And if we don't amend Part M quick enough, all of those houses won't be suitable for people to live in an appropriate way. Thanks, Chair.
Okay. Caroline, do you want to come back in?
I might just pass this one to my colleague John Wickham, who's actually an expert in this. Thank you.
Deputy, thank you very much. We talked about Part M, and I just wanted to give a broad overview of Part M, first of all, so that perhaps it can be wider understood as to what the regulation hopes to achieve. Part M sets about trying to achieve adequate provision for people in and about buildings, that they can access and use the buildings and their environs. The regulation itself is, I suppose, it underpins the philosophy of universal design. What does it mean essentially when it comes to the provisions that new buildings are, other than dwellings, are accessible and usable? Extensions to existing buildings are, where practicable, accessible and usable. That material alterations to the existing building stock, where it's conducted, make the provision for accessibility and usability of buildings, and where you've got changes of use to buildings from one type or another, that the adequate provisions are made for access and use. You're quite correct in terms of the regulation for new dwellings. New dwellings are visitable, but in essence, what that does mean is that there's an accessible approach to a dwelling, that a level threshold is provided at the main entrance, that door widths are sufficient width to cater for circulation throughout the building, that the circulation routes are adequate, that there's a WC at entry level, and that switches and sockets are at an accessible height. I suppose when it comes to dwellings themselves, there is a broad, we talk about houses and we talk about apartments themselves. So apartments themselves are, by their nature, more accessible in terms of the provisions in Part M require lifts. That I suppose that you will achieve the level access to each apartment, and I suppose the trend towards dwelling units now that are coming on stream through plan permissions, 40% of dwelling units are essentially through apartments. Industry trends do tend to go towards open plan design. And that's a new feature that we are responding to, but in fact it does favour universal design in terms of removing barriers to access and circulation throughout the dwelling. But I suppose in terms of the overall initiative to change Part M, we are very conscious of I suppose the costs associated with universal design, and as Caroline referred to, the National Disability Inclusion Strategy Action 97, which set out a task for the National Disability Authority to advise the implications of stakeholders, what it would mean for ways of achieving universal design solutions in housing, all housing, both private and social, and how they can be accessed and used by all, irrespective of age, size, or disability. That we are very keen to see what the outcomes of that cost-benefit analysis would be, and any consultations on that. But from our experience, the costs associated with providing for universal design can range from the low end of in the order of 15,000 to multiples of that. And I suppose, like in terms of, we just need to recognise that. We do recognise that apartments, by their nature, will be more UD friendly and implementable than housing would be. But I suppose the costs are something that we would like to see first, and those will be considered in full. Is that okay?
Just to advise the two non-members of the committee, I'm obliged to take the members first. So the next two speakers, questions I have is from Mick and then Jennifer. Mick.
Thanks, Chair. So I mainly want to make a couple of points about decongregation. But before I do, I'll just register my strong opinion that the Part M issue, we need to move as quickly as possible from new builds being, ticking the boxes on the visitation side of things, to the new builds being good for people with disabilities to live in. That needs to happen, and it needs to happen as quickly as possible. So on the decongregation, so if I'm right from what's being said, is that we had a position 10 years ago that there was approximately 4,000 people living in congregated settings. And that has been reduced by 50% over a period of a decade to the position of today, which is 2,087 persons. My understanding of the position is that there was a target that decongregation would be complete by the year 2019. Correct me if I'm wrong in that regard. In that sense, we've missed the target. Reasons have been given for that, but we have missed that target. So I don't want to dwell on that. I want to focus more on the question of reaching the target. I'd be concerned at the figure that was given for 2019, which I think was 160 persons. I calculate roughly that at that rate you would complete decongregation in 13 years' time, in the year 2032, but only if no people were to go into congregated settings in the meantime. So at the current rate of progress, you're looking at a best case scenario of decongregation in the 2030s. I think we need to do better than that. So the question is, what are the obstacles that are there? I would be interested to hear some information on that. Are they primarily financial obstacles? And if not, what is the character of them, and maybe tease that out a little bit.
Okay.
I might come back in on this, but I'd like to hear a reply on that.
Jennifer.
Thank you, and thank you very much for this morning. I think, as we know, disabilities is something, and I know my colleague John Dolan has been constantly highlighting and has gone around to the 31 local authorities with the issues, but there's massive issues. And you know, I think the reality is, even in my own area, I mean, children with a disability don't have a priority. And unless you actually have prioritised and have a system where people, or children or adults with disabilities, are prioritised, that when you go into the local authority, you know that they're on a list, that they will get a house very quick, as quick as can be possible. I understand there's a certain time, but that is not happening. And it's absolutely huge. And also you have to say, like, why? Why in 2019 is that not happening? And the other thing I feel that needs to be really addressed is, you spoke, Caroline, about the National Housing Strategy for People with a Disability is 8 years. It's going on 8 years. It hasn't been reviewed in 8 years. That should be reviewed. And I think that's huge. I think the system has changed so much. We have, you know, whether it's children or adults with disabilities, people are living longer. They could have a disability. So we need to have a look at that review as soon as possible. I think 8 years is too long. And can I just also ask, when the review is carried out, how long do you think that review will take before it's actually up and ready, I suppose, to probably go to all the local authorities and work with all the agencies? And just on the HSC, I just feel, I myself at the moment are dealing with a case of a man in his 70s that's actually in Kilkenny Hospital, and we cannot get him back to Carlow because he has nowhere to go, because he needs to be in a special house where people are there with disabilities. He's got a lovely family, but they actually won't be able to look after him, and he's 7 months in hospital, taking up a hospital bed. And I just feel it's unacceptable. He should be home. Every time I go to the health board or go about this, I'm told, oh, we have nowhere for him to go at the moment, we have nowhere. He's actually in hospital that he shouldn't be in. And I'm sure in other cases there has to be more, this must be happening around the country, because I have that particular case and I'm really worried about it, and it's a really concern for me and for the family. I just wanted to speak about the grants. We have the mobility aids grants, the housing adaptation grants, and the housing aid for the elderly. That's another massive issue. Payments sometimes are 99% of the time go in twice a year. So what happens is there's a backlog and people apply, and then they're told, they get a letter out saying your application is on hold, we are waiting for funding. So what happens is then we don't know within that 2 or 3 months time frame, if normally it's September, the funding normally comes in January, then there seems to be a bit of a break in July and August, and then in September there seems to be another kind of an allocation given out. But that's unacceptable, because what's happening is there is people that are months and months waiting for their grants, and particularly even when they changed the grants. I mean, you have to be 66 now for the grant. It was always 64. Overnight there, about 2 years ago, it got snuck in 66. And the age barrier is becoming a massive issue, because there is people that are having strokes, or there's people that maybe have MS or have other different things. And we're applying for all these grants. And I know now there is the hardship grant, and we are looking at that too. But there is people that genuinely need these grants and they're not getting them, and they are waiting months and months. But what really concerns me, and this is huge, I have a massive issue with this. The approval rate of applications for housing adaptation grants by local authority tenants appear to be approximately 50%. But what are the reasons for the remaining 50% don't get approval? And I've had incidents where I've had doctors' letters, I've had letters from maybe their doctor in a hospital, a different hospital, and they need the grant, and then the occupational therapist goes out and says, no, they don't need the grant. Like, who? Like, and I'm sure, look, I'm not criticising anybody here, but the main thing is, when a doctor gives a letter, or someone, you know, that genuinely has a really, really good case, and then you go to the council, and then somebody calls out, as you know, part of the procedure is someone from the local authority has to call out to assess it, and then they're told, no, you don't qualify for this grant, and then the people are coming in saying, well, why aren't I qualifying for the grant? I've got a disability, or I have an issue that I can't do this. So I think myself, and just in general, I think there's issues in the sense of, I think we need more communication with whether it's the HSE, the Carlow, or whatever council is, whichever one of the 31 local authorities it is, and I think even with the person themselves that have applied for the grant, because it is very disheartening when you're told you should have a grant, and then you find out you're not getting the grant. And it mightn't be true money now, it could be just the fact that they feel that they don't qualify for it. So maybe you could come back to me on this. The other one I want to ask you about, and that's why I think you need the review, mental health. I see, and I know Senator Boyhan asked about the steering committees. Mental health is huge. And my understanding is, when I send in letters for people maybe that suffer with depression or whatever, they're not being a priority either. So I think when the review is done, there needs to be, and I think every local authority and every councillor and everyone, TDs and senators, should have a list of priorities of in this review that you're doing, like people with disabilities, people with mental health, maybe people with other issues, because I don't think that's happening, and I just think that it needs to be put in this review. And the last thing I will ask is, how many bungalows get built every year? Because I feel with people with disabilities, bungalows are so important. And I think long term, whether it's people with disability or people living longer for grants or whatever, because there's a huge amount of money goes into grants, in fairness. But how many bungalows are built every year? Do you have an allocation that you send to every 31 local authorities and say, how many bungalows are you building, or how many people, if you said you've had the review, it's up, you get the review from the local authorities. So can you tell me how many bungalows every year are built for local authorities for people with disabilities, or children with disabilities, or people that have issues that they need a bungalow for? Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. I'll start with Kathleen, because I think Deputy Barry's were all related to yourself, Kathleen. So, and then I'll come to Caroline.
Thank you very much, Deputy Barry. maybe just to start with the figures first. Firstly, I think there was an expectation that decongregation could happen in a much faster pace than it was actually able to happen. And in 2009, we had 4,000 people in congregation settings. When the Programme for Government made its commitment in 2016, it set the target to reduce the number in congregation settings by 1/3 by 2021, and this target will be met. I think it's, and I suppose I've probably already said this, but it is important to remember that these are...
Was there a target for complete decongregation by 2019 set in 2009 or around that time?
My understanding is that there was a...
There may have been, I'm afraid I wasn't around then. The issue is the number in 2009, the targets were set a period after that. So the database, the initial database was 2009, then the database was 2012. So it's against those databases that we work off of.
Okay.
So our current position is that those within congregation settings 2,087, and we would share your view that it is really important that we increase the pace of this programme, and we would feel that given the amount of learning that we've had over the last number of years that we can do that. The targets within the service plan are very important because they set a clear focus for all of us to see, are we meeting those targets and are those people decongregating in the appropriate and the correct way. It is important that we get this move right for people, that they move into the community that they choose, that they have choice with who they live with, and that we support and provide those wraparound services that people need once they move out from a congregated setting back out into the community. So there is a whole new model of support that has to be provided by the HSE, and there has been significant effort to move that model. It has meant a move for staff in how they deliver their services, and it has meant a move for the kinds of services and supports that we are providing in the community. Our current policy is that there is no entry into congregated settings, so there is no expectation that we would increase the numbers within congregated settings. Our policy is that we are reducing people within congregated settings, and that we would move and enhance the pace that we move people back into the community as early and as swiftly and as possible as we can, bearing in mind their age profile and the length of time that individuals have spent within congregated settings. So in terms of those obstacles that you raised, I mean, it is about shifting and changing a whole model of care for the health system to a social model of care. And significant, and I think it has to be acknowledged that the HSE has committed significant work, effort and time and training to do that. It is about supporting the rights of individuals and supporting them to move to where they wish to move and how they wish to move. And it is around, I suppose, trying to get that right in the first instance. I mentioned earlier that the NDA are doing an evaluation programme of decongregation. This we welcome, and all of the early information that comes from that, because that helps us re-engineer or reorganise how we're going to deliver that decongregation programme. Because there is a significant learning in this, and I think we would all acknowledge that it has been a whole new and significant programme for the country to decongregate, but that we would see that as a priority for us.
Yeah, I'll come back to Mick. You can do this, get it answered for Jennifer and then.
Thank you. Senator, you raised the issue of children with a disability who don't have priority. I suppose just to look at that for a moment. Allocations, obviously, as you know, are a matter for the local authorities, and they set their scheme of priorities, as you probably know better than I would. And in that, I would say the very vast majority of them, of course, would have disabilities as one of the priority areas that they would look at. So I think it's perhaps not right to say that they don't prioritise, but what you have perhaps, and I think you're right about this, there are competing priorities. So there are homeless and other categories of people that they have to also look at. So I think the answer probably comes back to raising the awareness of the people who have disabilities on their lists and making sure that they make provision for them in the local authority setting to say that the design is done at that level. So I would say it's probably not true to say that children with disabilities don't have priority. I'm quite frankly, I'd say they probably are getting as much priority as every local authority can give them. I'm sure I wouldn't think that they're not. However, I think there are competing priorities, and I'm right about that. Some of the solutions to that is improving supply, and some of the solutions to that is improving awareness at local authority level. So we need to do both of those. So I agree with you with that. In relation to reviewing the National Housing Strategy, absolutely. Now, I will say that when we were doing Rebuilding Ireland in 2016, it did come up, so we were looking at it at that point, and it was agreed at that point that we would give it some extra time to implement. We were going well, and it needed it needed more time to bed down. I think now we're sort of through a stage where the structures are up and running and we've got them to a level that we could possibly take on more ambitious ideas. This report obviously can feed into that you're doing, and we will be doing that review. It's scheduled to happen for next year anyway, and what we'll be trying to do is make sure that as many people as possible can feed into that review. It's actually quite a wide, broad sector, so we need to do a proper consultation with the sector on that front and come back with something quite meaningful and hopefully ambitious in that regard. But there'll be a lot of feed-in to do before we do that. In relation to your query as to whether mental health was a priority, I would say actually the Housing Agency have done quite a lot of good work in that area. You know, they've done this document about designing for mental health. It's an area that's probably not as well understood as it might be. Yeah, so I think that's probably key, that local authorities understand how to design for mental health. Another area that I was impressed by last week, I heard a presentation from Hale, who are a very good AHB who deal with integrated living in the mental health for people with mental health difficulties. There are groups who are doing excellent work in that area, and it does require a level of expertise perhaps that's not present in every local authority, and I think that the representatives on the committees who are representing that particular mental health sector, there's work for them to do to make sure that that awareness is raised, and for the local authorities then to use the guidelines to help them to make sure that they're designing for people with mental health issues. Sometimes for them it's not a physical adaptation at all, potentially. It may be, but it may not be. It may be about the location. It may be about accessibility. So, and the supports package that's around them. There's probably work to be done in that space to make sure the support is there, because that's quite key. I might mention that we have tenancy sustainment officers that we've put in place that have been very good in terms of making sure that people with mental health and their tenancy is sustained. That's a key piece that both ourselves and Department of Health jointly fund. There's 10 tenancy sustainment officers in place, and their whole function is to make sure that the people with mental health difficulties continue with their tenancies, because that's frequently the piece. It may not be the house, it's actually making sure you pay your bills and making sure that you pay for your rent and things like that that needs to be supported. So some really good work happening in that area, so I'm pleased to be able to say that to you. In relation to bungalows, I will say that if it is the case that a local authority says to us, yes, bungalow, we want a bungalow for this, and they decide to buy one, yes, absolutely. You asked about new builds, however. Under the National Planning Framework and the density guidelines, I'm not sure that I'd be saying to you that new bungalows would be something that we would favour. I'd say that apartments, and you'll know when the apartment guidelines, 50% of apartments have to be 10% bigger than the minimum, and they lend themselves to universal. And my colleague John Wickham will be, this is his area, but he would know a lot about this. But if they're coming to us saying they already have a bungalow that exists and that's a good adaptation model for a decongregation setting, potentially there's no problem with that, and it might make sense in a particular given area from a cost perspective, so that's absolutely fine. In relation to the payments of grants, I might defer to my colleague Aidan, if that's all right, Chair.
Okay, yeah, that's fine, Aidan, yeah.
Yeah, Senator, the reference you made to funding and maybe stop-start, I would be puzzled about that as to whether maybe it's the local authority's own financial management. Certainly from the department's point of view, we have absolutely no hesitation or delay in issuing payments. For example, we have 71 million this year. I think at this about a halfway point, we'd be at about 22 million drawdown. We'd love that to be over half, you know, so we would actually be strongly encouraging local authorities to draw down money on a just-in-time basis, rather than let claims build up. That doesn't serve us any good, and I don't know how it might serve them any good to wait 3 months and then claim funding and then get going again. It certainly wouldn't be an approach to the scheme that we'd favour at all. It just doesn't seem to serve anyone financially, or particularly the clients in that. You mentioned mental health as well, and actually the meetings we had with local authority staff, this was raised as well. So we'd be interested in, you know, any analysis of this area, because I think looking forward on the housing adaptation grants, it definitely came up as an issue we need to, to look at. Yeah.
The grants at the moment, yeah.
Well, we would provide. It would be provided,
yeah.
But whether it's rigorously getting the same level of priority as other disabilities is a concern that was picked up in the recent engagements we had with local authorities.
Mick, you have some time left on your time. You wanted some follow-up there.
I just want to come back to the congregation, so that it be appropriate, that it be correct, that there be proper supports put in place. Strongly agree with all of that. But I'm sure you'd agree with me that those points shouldn't be excuses for implementing the policy more slowly than it might be. Kind of. So there's no one going into congregated settings this year. The numbers, according to the report, between 2012 and 2017 was for 222 persons. So can we take it that that's a thing of the past now? Do we anticipate that it's going to happen in the future, or do we feel that that's a thing of the past? If we were, I indicated earlier on that at the 219 rate of progress, that we're heading for decongregation, possibly sometime in the 2030s. If we were to say, we aimed to get that done within, say, 5 years, for argument's sake, what would need to be done? Would it require more finance? Would it require more... what measures would it require for us to do that and to try and speed up on this?
Okay, thanks, Mick. Kathleen again.
Just so, in relation to the decongregation programme, we know from what we've seen to date that the success factors are obviously the availability of housing, our ability to put in the wraparound services, to tailor them to the individuals, to allow the individuals time to consider transition, and then as they move towards transition to make any adaptations to the process that we are using. So there's been a build-up here in terms of changing the roles of staff and how staff are there to support decongregation. So much of that work is complete, but more of it needs to happen. I would say that the slower pace at the earlier beginning, we probably underestimated how long it was going to take to prepare people to transition. Some people were early adopters in terms of transitioning, they were ready to go, and some people need time to consider where they want to go, how they want to go, whether they want to go. So there's a piece of a lot of this is around the enablers that we can put in, the supports that we can give individuals, but also we have to allow people to make the decisions around their own decongregation and transitioning themselves. So that's a pace of time that probably, as we support people, build how we communicate with people, we can probably do a bit better. But there is certainly a piece here that we can't simply move people out within.
Can I just ask you on that, right? I hear what you're saying about people doing this at a pace that they're comfortable with. Would you say that the major stumbling block in terms of doing this more quickly is a concern on the part of people themselves about making that change? Or would you say it's more related to the ability of the state to provide those housing facilities and those wraparound services that you're speaking of?
I would say it's a combination of all of those. So it's the individual...
50-50?
I honestly couldn't say. I think part of the evaluations that are in place are probably the things that could help us see what are better enablers or what things can move faster. And I think that's why we welcome the fact that the NDA is doing an evaluation on this. But I would say it is a combination of individuals, but also individuals' families, the preparation of communities for people to be transitioned, and then obviously our planning around the services that we're providing within the state to individuals as they move out into the community.
Just a very brief comment, Chair. A very brief comment is that I hear what you're saying about a combination of both. But if we're accepting on the committee here that it is a combination of both, and I'm taking it that you're the expert in relation to this, then what we're saying is that in part, a failure on behalf of the state to provide the housing facilities and to provide the wraparound services is a factor, is an important factor in the fact that decongregation is going to be with us into the 2020s, and it would seem right through the 2020s. That's something that we're going to need more discussion on, I think.
Okay,
about
thanks,
the question
Deputy
of those
Barry.
resources.
Yeah, I'll take the last three questioners now. So, Deputy O'Brien.
And thank you indeed for your presentations. Apologies, I was at a meeting beforehand, but I read your opening statements in advance of the meeting. Some of the areas and some of the questions that I wanted to ask have been covered, but I just on decongregation, if I could, Kathleen, certainly my experience of it as a TD as well. It is complex, it is sensitive as well with families and with service users too. And I've had occasion with one group in particular I'm dealing with whereby there's a resistance to that decongregation, people who've been longer in that type of setting. Obviously we want people out in the communities, but it is one of the targets that I understand why it probably shouldn't have been set at 2019. It was overly ambitious. Each individual and each family have their own needs, and there's certainly a sensitivity around it. I understand completely what Mick is asking on that, but you can't. There are some instances where it's very difficult to force people into a solution. So that just being said, that you take it from this committee that. No, yeah, I know that. I'm just saying that it's not black and white, and it's not just about not meeting a target. And I think that needs to be put on the record, Mick, and I'm not disagreeing with anything that you've said. You'll take it from the committee here that it is a priority for the committee. It certainly is for myself and my party colleagues, that process moves forward at pace, as in conjunction and cooperation with people themselves, who are most important, and indeed their families, and that their needs are kept. But I wanted to just to cover a couple of things, and maybe, Caroline, if it's okay, just a couple of quick questions for you. And one of them is around the national implementation framework, and the framework and the strategies set out therein are certainly noble and are certainly important. And I note in your opening statement, you spoke about one of the most significant achievements in the strategy being the establishment of housing disability steering groups, the HDSGs, in each of the local authorities. Have you got a sense for how they're working? Do you, as a department, I'm not expecting you to hold their hands, but are we, because they're relatively new, are they being monitored? How often are they meeting? Do you have any oversight of that? I suppose I asked that question on the basis that I suppose when you look at the housing crisis as it is now across both public and private housing, it's even more acute for people with disabilities. It's more complex, the waiting times are longer, the services that are needed, the wraparound services that are needed. I'll give you a couple of examples, and I suppose all of us could have come in with examples of individual cases and families that are dealing with us. Just more from the perspective of how families are interacting with their local authorities and other groups, particularly for adults with severe physical disabilities, with elderly parents. And I have a couple of cases like this whose parents are of an advanced age, still caring at home for young adults, now people my age in their 40s, and with no prospect of at this stage of any residential assisted living. And certainly in my own CHO Area 9, it took me 12 weeks to even get an answer as to what the disabilities budget was by way of parliamentary question, to be able to filter that down towards the family. So I'm just wondering, when you talked about the numbers of people with disabilities on our list of reducing, being over 4,000, are we capturing everybody there? Are you confident that we're capturing everybody? Because the reality of what I find on the ground with that family that I'm dealing with, his parents are nearly 80 years of age and have been engaging with the HSE, with the local authority, with groups like Praxis. I've been writing back and forth, and we're getting basically nowhere with us. And I know many other families who are in that situation. I think it's such a sensitive and distressing issue for people, particularly as they are moving forward, as their ages are advancing, about what's going to happen with their kids. One of the answers we were given in a meeting, by the way, and I'm not asking anyone to stand over this, was that, well, if a solution wasn't in place and if something happened to one of the parents, well, then that this young adult will have to go to Beaumont Hospital. And that was the solution. So go to Beaumont, go to the hospital, they'll have to take it from there. That's not acceptable, but that's the reality for a lot of people. I have a 44-year-old woman who spent 8 years living in a nursing home in North Dublin, and her case is quite public, who's working, who's getting a taxi to work. That's the reality of providing housing for people with disabilities on all different types of the spectrum. So whilst the strategy is good, I'm trying to get a handle on, firstly, the transparency within it. So why can't we be told what the allocation in each of our areas are for providing housing for people with disabilities? And Senator Murnane O'Connor mentioned one, and I do want to absolutely back her up on this, is I find from experience as well there can be a distinction made between both physical and severe mental disabilities, and there shouldn't be, because in many instances it's the wraparound services that are what's letting, I suppose, the process down, and some cases are complex. But again, I wonder, have you got a view for average waiting times across for people with disabilities versus people who are able-bodied and on the list? Because I certainly find, from my own experience, that it is much longer. On the housing adaptation grants, and we talked about this last year actually when you were here, you mentioned as well that the process is going to be, or is in the process of being streamlined. When is the streamlined process going to be in place? This was raised last year, John. I'm not sure whether you were at committee, but when we were talking about the number of people who may be in either residential care or hospitals waiting for adaptations to be carried on their houses. And I certainly find from different local authorities that they deal with those things differently. So I'm wondering, it is a very useful tool to adapt, family homes and that to people's needs. But I do find, and Aidan, in your response there, you were talking about this, that there being no sort of backlog within the department. I certainly find from dealing with local authorities, there can be, the processing time takes longer and longer as the year goes on. So I would be interested to hear about, you actually said it in your opening statement, Caroline, about that process being streamlined at local authority level, and what's that going to look like, and what would it mean in real terms to people. So I'll leave it at that, Chair. Thanks.
Darragh. John, do you?
My apologies particularly to the witnesses. I wasn't here for the start of the session, but I had read your papers. I was in next door with the Health Committee dealing with disability-related stuff. My overriding sort of sense listening to this today is, are we all fools in some way or other? We make representations. You've heard it there, you've heard it from other members of the committee about real life situations for people. You provide material for PQs, you come in and you give witness to what's going on and what the policy is, and nothing substantial seems to move on. And that's just an overriding kind of sense I have. The Rebuilding Ireland has a piece in it about, as you well know, people with disabilities. And it's full of strategy and process and sub-process and sub-strategy, and this one feeding into that one and that one feeding into the other one. I thought it was very telling that it didn't mention at that time the 3,919, and I'm simply going from memory, of the known number of people with disabilities from surveys that had been done in 2013 who were waiting for housing. And what that told me was, we're going to tell them about all the processes and our commitments and our policies, but we're not going to go down and get dirty and actually say there is an actual problem here now. We have in Ireland an horrendous housing problem for our general population. There's no two ways about that. We have had the same horrendous housing problem for people with disabilities for decades. The Irish Wheelchair Association were in here last week. They championed and laid out on getting the first retrofit programme in Ireland, then the DPG, Disabled Persons Grant. That goes back late 60s, early 70s. And we've trudged along and shoved along since then. So that's just a sense of how I situate where we are this morning. Let me go into the three papers. And the first is a very particular, I relate to the local authority, Dublin Local Authority first, a very specific question that's coming from representations being made to me. When it comes to to the housing of people with a disability, is there a difference between, or a nuance between, a person holding a primary medical certificate and a person with a medical priority from the council? Are they on the same housing list, or are they weighted the same or differently? And how does the council assess somebody as having a disability in order to prioritise housing needs? That's a very specific question. Going back to my opening remarks, we're back in what I was describing from Rebuilding Ireland, description of the housing strategy, and a template for disabled adapted units is currently being designed by the Housing Department. So that suggests there isn't one and hasn't been one. Can you give evidence of the situation improving? You have set out, and I'll honour it, you have tables there that are quite clear. I'm not reading from them. I can't see from those that things are getting better in terms of the demographic for need, etc., etc. I can see the numbers of people with different kinds of disabilities, the adaptations, the ramps, etc., etc. But I actually can't see an assessment that, you know, guys, we're beginning to drain the swamp. Things are getting better, and it'll take us at this rate 5, 10, 20 years. I don't know whether we're treading water, and my instinct is that we're actually losing ground, even though there's some extra numbers being put in. I think we need to know where we're just giving the factual numbers and not situating them in terms of whether we're making progress. The sense of people with disabilities and their families on waiting lists is that it is getting worse, not better. That's the sense. We don't have, I can't see evidence here that that's improving. And I thought it was very telling that on page 4, housing adaptation grant for people with disabilities. Maximum grant for houses erected for more than 12 months and for those less than 12 months. If we were actually getting behind the issue, you wouldn't need to be, you wouldn't need the less than 12 months or to be a much more modest figure, because you'd actually be proactively making sure that bills that were built in the last 12 months were more accessible, or were accessible to people. So look, that's, I'll leave that at that. The Caroline Timmins and colleagues from the Housing Department, you use language such as, I would like to assure the committee that the provision of housing is a key priority for the department. And I've heard other people, I think it was Kathleen, maybe talk about the competition in relation to priorities. Well, it strikes me that if a government has said that X number of people are going to be out of congregated settings by such a date, that they've actually triaged the situation and made a decision and made a priority by putting figures to it. This is going to happen. So therefore, it should be gone beyond the competition. That's a government, in my view, or a department, in my view and understanding, saying, we've looked at all the competing things, and God knows that's what governments do every day of the week. But we've nailed our colours. We're now saying this will be closed out by. And so what I'm suggesting is that goes beyond current competing priorities. You've actually said, and the main work of government is to discriminate. It's to make decisions in budgets and everywhere that says, these are the things we're doing, to what extent and whatever. So the talk about the national housing strategy as part of a coherent framework.
Just, Senator, I'm conscious of the
right,
time.
okay.
So
let me come
you.
to conclusion. I suppose the point I'm making, I do want to honour the fact that on page 4 that there is a reference to numbers where they're going in the right direction. Look, I won't make any particular comments on the Department of Health one, other than to say 13,000 plus young people in nursing homes is the other side of the decongregation coin. The same public body that's trying to get people out is actively putting people in. Just to conclude, Cathaoirleach, children, I just want to focus on one simple thing. We have a small number of children born every year with congenital conditions or something comes along early in life. They're typically in families where a lot of them would be parents, maybe have bought a house, trying to struggle with that and the costs. The disabled grant, in no way, and this is the thing about you're eligible or ineligible, the disabled grant in no way can help them to actually provide an accessible home for those children. And this is at a time, those numbers are small. There may be other children in the house. One child in the house is not even in an accessible home with their siblings. And we have cracked the nut of them being able to go to local regular schools. I think there really needs, and I'm asking you, all of you, to think very strongly about something, some programme that will actually make it possible for those families to operate as a family inside their front door, never mind the issues that are outside their front door. I'm going to leave it at that, Cathaoirleach, and thanks for your tolerance.
No problem. Gino?
Thanks, Chair. I'm not sure if this was covered, but I'll talk about it very, very briefly. It's a very specific question. It's in, and thanks for the presentations today. It was very, very good. Just in relation to the housing adaptation grant for people with disabilities for private houses. And I understand the criteria. The threshold is 60,000 for the income of the house, and the grant is 30,000. Now, that leads into a lot of problems. One is some adaptation are much more than, some could run actually 50,000, 60,000, 70,000, 80,000 and so forth. And the income threshold is 60,000. That means that if both parents are on the average industrial wage, they can't get nothing. Nothing. Which is absolutely incredible. And if they go over the 60,000, even by, I know there's a disregard for children and other kind of fists and so forth, and the assembly rounds, but that will put them over the limit and they don't get zero. Now, I think that is extremely discriminatory. And I would be asking your opinion, would there be a review on the income thresholds or the grant? That's one question. And it should be, in some cases, discretionary, where there's a friend of mine that has got an adaptation in Clondalkin, and that adaptation cost over 100,000. She got less than 12,000 euros from the county council. And that's obviously, it's an adaptation that's badly needed for her child. So I just think there should be a review on either the thresholds or the grant given to parents, because if you have a child that has special needs, them needs have to be met in that household. And these things don't come cheap whatsoever. And correct me if I'm wrong, I think there was, at one stage back about 11 years or 12 years ago, it was kind of based on kind of where you were living in the county. So it was taken kind of in relative amounts in relation to land costs and skills costs. So the main question is that, will this threshold be up for review in the coming period?
Okay, thanks. I'll start with maybe Kathleen.
Thank you very much, Senator. Just to address the issue in relation to the nursing homes. So the information that we have from the Nursing Home Support Scheme tells us that there's 1,200, this is under 65 in a nursing home, and we know from some research by GCU that between a quarter and a half of those may be people with disabilities who are inappropriately placed. The criteria for entry into nursing homes is based on activities of daily living and the need for 24-hour nursing care. So it would seem that these individuals are individuals who have complex requirements to be supported in the community. We would fully accept that it's important that those who are inappropriately placed, that our CHOs would prioritise trying to address how those can be more appropriately placed. And that's actively what they do in terms of waiting lists and priorities. but those are the figures that we have at the minute. And we do continually monitor the Nursing Home Support Scheme database to see how those numbers might vary year on year.
Okay. I'll go around because I don't want to. Sorry, Caroline, if you want to come in now.
To Deputy O'Brien's questions. I think the first question you had for me were the HSDGs functioning, Deputy. I think that, first of all, I think I probably said this earlier, but it was the actual formation of them in the first place that was a very important event, and that's very good. So after that, I will say that there's always improvements that can be made. There are 31 of them, and they're probably not all operating in exactly the same manner, and that's been possibly a challenge that we need to address, and we are addressing. The Housing Agency has been given the task of looking at the functioning of those particular groups, and they are doing that at the minute. They're doing some very good work going around with new terms of reference for them to make sure that they're all working in the same way, standardise the functioning, also to look at the targets that they're setting in their strategic plans and making sure that they're working in the manner that they're supposed to, making sure that they're meeting 4 times a year, that the representatives are on the committee from the 4 disability sectors. So I would say to you, are they functioning? Yes, they are, but there are improvements that can always be made, and we are aware of that and trying to make that happen. So I think that the housing subgroup will keep looking at that and keep making sure that those improve as time moves on. I think once they embed further into the system, they will naturally function a little bit better. Are we capturing the need? I think was one of the questions that you asked. I think that that's a good question. We do capture the need every year through the summary of social housing assessment, who's actually on the waiting list, but you make a point about the emerging need, and I think that's something that we do need to be conscious of. You will know from the development plan cycle that within the development plan cycle there's a housing strategy that gets developed, and we're coming into that cycle now later in the year for each of the local authorities, and it's important as part of that strategy that they do a housing needs demand assessment, and that they think as part of that about the vulnerable sectors who will need to be accommodated, and that they think about their demographics and who may need housing in the future, and that their future projections are done in a way that accommodates not just disability. There's plenty of things that obviously they'll have to take into account, but disability is one of them. And I'd be keen that would happen, and we're looking at the housing needs demand assessment in the department right now. It's part of it's one of the objectives under the NPF, and how we can improve both the data we feed into how we do our projections and what we get out of it for local authorities so that they can inform their own plans. So that's something we're keen to work on. In relation to what the Department of Health is doing, I think the Department of Health already brought out in their statement that part of their action plan in 2019 is about establishing future social care needs for people with a disability, and what we need then is for that to translate into some information for us in relation to housing that we can then feed back into local authorities. So I think you're right that that's an area that we need to be able to cover and we need to do it better in the future. So it's not all about the list. The list is very important, though, in terms of informing who needs the house today, and so it's not that both need to function together to form a picture for the local authority. I think you also asked about adaptation grants. Perhaps I might leave that to my colleague, sure. But I might just come back to Senator Dolan's
Before you go on, I did ask
or,
about, sorry Caroline, just
yes.
the additional wait time on average. Have we tracked that for persons with disabilities?
I'm just checking there. The Summary of Social Housing Assessment does track waiting time, but it doesn't track it for people with disabilities specifically. Now, I would say you're probably right that obviously people with disability probably are waiting longer. Yeah. That's probably a fact. I'm not disagreeing with you in any way, but I wouldn't have actual data on what the waiting times are.
We might consider actually potentially tracking that or looking towards tracking it, because I think we'll find
it might be something we could raise with the HDSGs. There's lots of things that we might consider as part of that strategy as to what are the priorities in terms. I don't want to overload with looking for too much data, but it's something. If we can find the key metrics that we're looking for, then those could all be fed into that.
Thank you.
That would be helpful. I might, before and there's a couple of questions on adaptation grants. Before I pass over, I could address Senator Dolan's points. I suppose the first to say that I know you made the point that you think nothing happens, and I suppose you're not seeing evidence of it.
You may be modest.
Yeah, I have to say, I just didn't want to let the moment pass without remarking on the amount of work that we do see going on, and we're in a position to see it because we're working in the area, and we do see the amount of work that goes on in not only the housing agency but the local authorities and DCC and all of the rest, and that Department of Health or our colleagues are doing. So it's perhaps an opportunity not to lose the amount that is going on.
I recognise there's a lot going on, but I don't see a lot of product for it. You're not telling us about product.
I suppose what I can say to you is that there were 1,457 people with disabilities who were accommodated last year in social housing. Obviously, it's a difficult area for everybody, but we are working on it. And I suppose not to lose sight of the fact that the strategies that we do prepare and that we do try to implement do have an effect, and I think that we are doing things better in the disability area. So I wouldn't concur with you on that front. I think we are doing quite a lot.
Why didn't you tell us, Karen?
But I think actually you've got a load of reports in from the Housing Agency and from the HSE that will tell you a lot about what's going on in the area, and I hope you'd be comforted to know that we are putting priorities on this insofar as we can within the available resources. And everything is competing, and I know you make that point, but this is an area we do prioritise, and this is an area that we absolutely agree with you that needs to be prioritised. In relation perhaps to the grants, then I'm going to let my colleague Aidan deal with those because I think there were 3 questions on it.
Sure. Okay. Deputy O'Brien asked about the process of looking at the grants and when that might bear fruit. So our aim would be to have new, streamlined, more simpler forms this year. So, as I said, I mentioned earlier, in the engagements we've done with the local authorities, we've identified the structure of the forms, the paperwork around the forms, that we think there's a bit that can be done around that. We've already lined up to speak with the NDA, having had the engagement with the local authorities to talk to them about the way the forms would be done, the language in the forms and stuff like that, to try and get their input as well. I think you asked as well about, you mentioned hospital exits as well. That is something we've asked the local authorities to make sure there's live contacts, continuous contacts between hospitals and the local authority staff who can affect these grants and make them happen quick.
Doesn't really happen, eh?
Yeah, well, I think it will be patchy. I think it will be patchy or at different levels of success or otherwise. So again, we addressed that in the workshops we had with the 31 local authorities. And again, we think that as part of the reforms and improvements this year, we'll be putting that one as an important area of response as well. Deputy Kenny asked about the maximum grants and that as well. It's 30,000, as you said, for people with disability. We found in the feedback we got from local authorities across all the schemes, there's also 8,000 for older people, 6,000 for the mobility grants. There was feedback that those limits certainly we're struggling with those limits, and people are struggling in terms of in some cases, the average grant would often be quite low, the average level of grant, but that doesn't mean the situations don't arise where people need a good bit more than the maximum currently caps them at. So we are going to be looking at that as part of this review this year of the maximum grant. We have to look at that in the context, obviously, if we'd be aiming to do about 11,000 grants with about 71 million euros of funding. If we increase the thresholds across some of the schemes or all of the schemes, we might end up not being able to do as many grants. If even with a certain level, because we've been getting a year-on-year increase since 2014. So we just need to put the numbers together to say, well, if we increase the grants by how much, where will that leave us in terms of the spread and the number of grants we can deliver? And that,
Could there be cases where it could be discretionary, where there's certain cases where, the bill could be 100,000 plus? Could there be exceptions made? We
definitely encourage local authorities to really be inventive, I suppose, about how they respond to different grant schemes. The thing about the 30,000 max, we wouldn't have maybe a huge amount of situations where we'd recommend straying above that if a local authority asks us. Now, most of the time we don't know. The local authority will decide on the merits of the case itself. But generally, I'm going to say the feedback we'd have is there isn't much straying above the maximum amount. I suppose the idea, the precedent would be very much in the local authorities' views. If they were to set precedents of exceeding the 30,000 or whatever is the capped amount, would that, you know, make them put them in a position of not being able to allow for, or being in a difficult position to refuse any further grants that exceed the maximum. So I think if we can look at the maxima across all the grant schemes as part of the review and raise them if that's appropriate, if construction charges have gone up, that would be a smarter way to do it, rather than, you know, have individual local authorities responding in one area and not in another area. You asked about the earnings as well. Again, on the earnings, we tend to have the 60,000 has been in place for a while now. Again, it's something we need to look at in the context of, if we get a bit of an increase, when we increase both the maximum limits and the earnings, what would be the impact on that in terms of trying to spread the number of grants and spread the benefit of the grants as widely as possible. So I'd probably have a bit more expectation that we'd be looking positively at the grant maximums, maybe not so much at the earnings limits. We haven't decided on either of those, but just to give you a realistic prospect of what might change and what might not change on that. I mean, the last thing I'd mention, just in response to Senator Dolan's point about, he made good points about the gap between having policies and strategies and the implementation. I mean, that's absolutely the case. If we're not getting down and dirty and figuring out where the implementation blocks are and challenges are, well, then we're going to struggle even with the best strategies. So I know that the housing adaptation grants is just one of the suite of responses we make here, but the effort we've done recently in working with the 31 local authorities and trying to just flush out what are the different approaches, what are the blockages, what's the mindset even of staff dealing with it, and they might vary from one local authority to another. Is one local authority very rigid about the forms and paperwork they're demanding, and another is more fluent? Is one a bit more flexible about the maximum grants than another? So we've tried to drill into that and get everyone, the real practitioners in the local authorities, around and figure some of these solutions out. And that's what we want to bring next, to engage with the likes of the NDA and other bodies to try and improve that. And again, I know the numbers of people who require housing even is a challenge, but I know, like, there's a project being opened, I think in the next couple of weeks in Slane. It's in County Meath. It's 17 CAS units as part of an overall 26-unit development with 2 housing, and the 17 CAS units are targeted for people with disability. It's just an example of a project that, you know, if you were at that opening, and I haven't seen them, but I will be probably at that opening in the next couple of weeks, I'd be looking forward to seeing the quality of what's being done there and the difference that will make those 17 houses in a blended development. It's only one set of new houses, but obviously for the people who will occupy those houses, it's a real life changer.
We are okay. Sorry.
Just to go back to Deputy Barry and Deputy O'Brien raised the issue about decongregation. I don't want us to leave here today with a negative about what we have achieved in what we believe has been a hugely positive process. Deputy Barry wanted to know why we weren't meeting targets. I'm not familiar with the 2019 target. The target that I'm familiar with was set in 2016 by the government, that by 2021 we would have reduced the number by a third, and we will achieve that. Deputy Barry also asked why we weren't achieving the targets. A number of things happened. We had it started in 2009. We had the economic downturn. We had regulation came in 2013. We had a change of model of service, as we have said, that we have changed to. That involved something new for staff, for individuals. We will only move people who are going to be moved under the new process and under the new care model. And that's a wraparound service of supports for people. To deliver on it, we need accessible housing stock. We need to adapt all the housing. That takes considerable time. Something that I'm sure you would share with us are deep regret about the whole thing is that a number of people took properties off the market when they found out that the HSE was buying them for people to move. And frankly, I can't understand that. So we need to be able to get properties that are centrally located as well for people. So that all takes time. It has been hugely successful then for the people who have moved.
Okay, thank you, Patsy. Owen, you wanted to...
Just in relation to the adaptation grant, obviously in another area of work, government is looking at the possibility of a blended grant and loan finance model for retrofitting of private properties. It would be a shame if that was introduced and that type of facility was not made available to private homeowners for the purposes of retrofitting, of adapting their own homes. It wouldn't be a huge additional cost, but that model where you get a portion grant, whether it's up to the 30,000, but you can then access long-term low-interest finance, is just eminently sensible. So I suppose I just urge you, whoever is looking at that, whether it's in the Department of Housing or some other department with respect to energy efficiency retrofitting, it would make sense for them to be talking to yourselves to see if that could be applicable for adaptation grants, because it would seem to be the kind of solution that would work for a lot of families.
Maybe I'll just ask a few specific questions. Sorry, John. Sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
Very briefly, the Department of Health, in relation to the 1,300 or thereabouts in the nursing homes, it's my understanding that nursing homes, the profile of people in them are in their 80s. They're quite vulnerable, and on average, they're spending 2 years of their life there. Whatever about people needing very specific upscaled supports, I do contest that places that are for people with that profile is not appropriate for younger people with disabilities. We're all a bit younger than that. We innately know this. The other point is and I had put the request to the witnesses, but I'd also put it to the committee for consideration, and Deputy Kenny incidentally backed it up in the sense that the points he was making. How can we countenance the idea that children will not be able, we won't have a specific support for them to be able to live in their own home in the same way as their brothers and sisters? We've lots of challenges on the footpaths and all other places. They're actually going to mainstream schools now, and they can't actually be free and easy in their own house. Now, there can be lots of different solutions, but that has to be taken by the scruff of the neck. And I'd be looking at the Cathaoirleach of this committee to particularly underline it. Sinead, and thanks very much for everybody.
Yeah, thanks, John. Maybe just one or two brief questions, and it has been a very informative 2 days of engagements in relation to this issue. But just in relation, and each county I know has their own different policy in how they allocate the funding, and just in my own county it's done on a time basis, so they get the allocation, they advertise, there's a closing date, then the money is allocated, and then sometimes what happens, I think Jennifer might have referred to, some of that money mightn't be spent, which then becomes sort of available towards the end of the year. But I often do question of this timing, that, there's a closing date on something. Because what's happening in a number of cases in my own county is that people who are probably more deserving, who come in later in the year, and now at this stage, there's no funding available. And this thing of, if you don't spend it, you lose it. Sometimes I do question that model, or the way we assess things. And just a slight observation on that. Sometimes I think it's closing date, it's advertised, it's promoted. People probably who apply for some of these grants probably don't really need them yet, but yet they eat into resources which might be required later in the year by people who are more deserving of it. And sometimes I think having a rolling fund available all the time as a specific closing date possibly should be looked into. Just one other point I would like to make, and it's in relation to the state not being in a position to deal with everybody with people with disabilities. We all honestly know we don't have the stock of housing. Hopefully in the future we will have the right stock and the right levels of housing coming apart. Is there any incentives out there for landlords to make their properties adapted for people with disabilities? Just a specific question.
Yeah, I might respond to the grants one first. Again, I have to say, closing dates, we simply don't want them. We don't, and we would, talk that through in any local authority if we hear about it, and we would have heard a bit in the recent engagements, or we would also hear anecdotally or from political representations. We would not encourage closing dates. We don't see the logic of it. I suppose we've been in a good position in the last number of years, funding having gone down maybe up to 2013. It's now been on an upward trajectory in the last few years. We feel on the adaptation grants that means a local authority knows now at the start of every year you're going to have at least the same funding, if not an increased funding next year. So really the opportunity to operate on a complete rolling, open all the time basis is there. So that point came up in the recent engagements, and that rolling approach rather than a deadline approach or a closing date approach is what we want to see everywhere.
I appreciate that.
Just in relation to your question in relation to incentives for landlords, I suppose we'd have to tease out what exactly you mean probably by that. It sounds like it's something that could be explored. I don't think there's anything specific that our department has for landlords.
I'm just saying, the state either provide housing for people with disabilities, or the private individual provides his own adaptation for their own house. But we're not meeting the needs of people with disabilities out there. So the state can't reach it within its own physical stock. And then we have the private individual who's in their own residence. But there's landlords out there whose houses could be adapted for people with disabilities if there was a specific incentive schemes around that towards landlords to provide that type of accommodation. Just to see, could we increase the supply of housing,
Yeah, I suppose there's two aspects of that, the private and the public. I mean, where we do engage with landlords in leasing housing for social housing tenants under certain arrangements, I suppose that would be an easy one to say that we could do that.
Yeah.
But in relation to the private, I think that's more complex.
I suppose I was more talking about the first example where, it's in relation to people on our own housing lists that we're not going to get to, where you could enter an agreement with a landlord that a house has been adapted for specific needs. Do you know what I mean? If that incentive was there. And I don't think there is any incentive there at the moment for that.
There might not be a specific incentive, but I don't think that that would necessarily be an issue if that housing was being provided under a long-term lease, potentially. Depends on, obviously, a number of factors. It's an idea that maybe it needs a little bit more teasing out to see with my colleagues whether that's something that we could facilitate, but if it was something that was coming through in a recommendation for the committee, that would enable us to take that forward and do the necessary work to explore it, certainly.
Okay.
I'd be happy to do that.
Sorry.
There might be grants that could connect.
The private house grants, adaptation grants, would actually provide in some cases for adaptation of a private house that would be rented to someone.
Okay.
And that, now, I don't know if it's extensively used, but it is available in some of those situations.
Okay. Thanks, Aidan. Okay. Where am I now? I would like to thank all the witnesses for attending today and engaging with the committee. And as I said, this has been 2 very informative days, and it will feed into a report. So I propose to adjourn the meeting, and the next meeting of the Joint Committee will be held on Wednesday, the 18th of September. So enjoy your summer recess. Thank you all very much. Thank you.